Okay, this is our last lecture in the Apologetics class. We've made it all the way down to the end of our outline. This is what I've been calling Lecture 15b, and we're going to be talking about the problem of religious language. So I'll zoom in. This is the last appendix now, appendix number 3, the problem of religious language. Now, this is a problem similar to the problem of evil and similar to the problem of free will and divine determinism, in the sense that it is a problem that atheists are bringing to the table and claiming that this is a reason not to believe in the existence of God. The problem here has to do with the difficulty of describing an infinite being with finite language. Okay? So the atheist in this situation would say, look, it's impossible. This idea of an infinite being just doesn't make any sense. How could we even describe an infinite being using our finite language? So I'll lay out the problem, how it's usually laid out. So they would say, how could something even be? How could a being even be infinite? What does that even mean? Even if there was an infinite being, how could we ever know anything about such an infinite being? Because our minds and our language are finite. So even if there is an infinite being, we couldn't know anything about this being. So that's a good reason to, according to them, reject that there even is such a being. It just doesn't make sense. Therefore, what they would say then is all of our God talk is meaningless. Religious language, if you will, God talk. All of our language about God is meaningless, because it's meaningless to try to describe an infinite being with finite language. So our God talk is meaningless. Now there's 3 major positions, and we'll look at a hybrid as a 4th, but there's 3 major positions, responses, if you will, to this problem. The first position is that our God talk is univocal. The second one is that our God talk is equivocal. And then the third one is that our God talk is analogous. So let's just go through them one at a time. And the first response is that our God talk is univocal. Our religious language, our language about God is univocal. So this position basically just rejects the problem. This position just says, look, it's not a problem at all. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. There's really no problem here. This position claims that words in our religious language, our God talk, uses words that mean exactly the same thing as they mean in other contexts. That's why it's called univocal. So think of unity. Maybe help a way to remember. I always get these terms confused. So a way that I cheat and remember which term means what, I can remember the ideas, just not the right terms for them often. But univocal, unity, okay? So this position says that the words, when we use them of God, are unified. They mean exactly the same thing as when we use these words in other contexts to talk about finite things. So I'll give you some examples. When we say that Bob is a good guy, and we say that God is good, according to this position, there's no difference at all between how we're using good in the first context with Bob and how we're using the term God, good, in the second context to talk about God. The 2 terms are univocal, or the 2 instances of the use of the same term good is univocal. We're meaning the exact same thing when we say that Bob is good and we say that God is good. So we can use finite language to describe an infinite God because our words are univocal in that sense. Now, some in this camp claim that these ideas in our minds, goodness in this case, that we express in language, were ultimately given to us by God. So they would be kind of Platonic in that sense, people in this camp, in the sense that they're saying that these ideas of goodness, the ideas of other attributes of God, were ideas given to us by God, and that's why it's appropriate for us to have them and use them and express them in our language, because we got them from God. Not Platonic necessarily in the sense that these attributes exist out there on their own apart from God, but they exist out there as being in God or of God, attributes of God. And so He gave us this knowledge of His attributes, and therefore it's appropriate for us to speak of them, even in our finite language. So in other words, we have infinite ideas, ideas of infinity, ideas of an infinite being, His attributes in our minds, because God put them in our minds. And that's why it's Platonic in a sense. They're saying there's a one-to-one match between our ideas about God and how God actually is. There's a one-to-one match, if you can conceptualize this for a moment. There's an exact similarity, a unity. That's why it's univocal. There's an exact match between how God actually is and our ideas of God in our minds that we communicate through our language, because God put them in our mind. And this is what, like, St. Augustine taught, who was very Platonic, obviously. So let's run through some problems with the univocal position. Critics of this position would say, look, words can't apply to God like they apply to humans in the exact same way. So back to the situation where we say God is good and we say that Bob is a good guy. Look, Bob and God are just so different that we can't use the same word in the exact same way to describe a finite human being, Bob, and this infinite God. Another criticism of this position would say that it implies our language and our ideas are infinite. And that seems to give us way too much credit, that we have ideas of infinite attributes, infinite goodness, infinite power, all that stuff. It doesn't seem like finite creatures are able to have that sort of knowledge. Or it seems to imply that God is finite. For us to understand Him, that makes God not infinite but finite. And we know that that can't be right. So both horns of the dilemma would be horns that would want to reject this position. Critics would also say that this Platonic model just doesn't work, because words in our language aren't fixed to specific definitions. They would point out that, look, even if we do have these infinite ideas in our mind, God's infinite attributes of this infinite being, we can't communicate that in our language because our language is fluid. We can't capture these ideas in our language because our words don't have a one-to-one equivalence with ideas in our mind. And this goes into the philosophy of language a little bit, but I think you would understand that language is relative, language is fluid, and I would affirm that as well. Truth isn't relative, truth isn't fluid, but our language is. So an obvious example would be like the word bark, right? So the word bark can be used in a very relative, or the term bark is relative and fluid, and it can mean different things in different contexts. That's what I mean by it being relative and fluid. So I can say, my boss barked orders at me this morning, or my dog barked out in the yard this afternoon, or my bark, so there's some bark falling off of the tree outside. So our language isn't fixed and absolute. And so that causes problem for this position. going back to the problem is religious language again. And there's not a critic of this position would say there's not a one-to-one connection between, even if we could have infinite ideas, we can't express them. There's not a one-to-one connection between our ideas and words we would use, because words aren't fixed like that. So they would say even if there are fixed Platonic essences, fixed Platonic attributes of an infinite God, there's no fixed, unchangeable words to describe them. So we're back to square one. It's a problem of religious language. Our experience with language shows that definitions aren't fixed. So even if there are fixed, unchangeable attributes of God, there's no fixed, unchangeable words to describe these fixed, infinite attributes. So it goes back to square one, the problem with religious language. So here's a popular argument against the univocal position. Lays out like this, premise one: all of our knowledge comes from our sense experiences, our sense of sight, taste, touch, smell. All of our knowledge comes from our senses. We don't experience God with our senses. We can't see God, can't smell God, can't touch God. We must get our knowledge of God indirectly then, through our sense knowledge of finite creatures and finite creation. All of our knowledge of God has to come from our sense experience of the finite realm. Therefore, premise 4, we're unable to speak of God except in the knowledge and words that we develop from our sense experience of finite creation and finite creatures. Since we don't experience God directly through our senses, our finite language, which is just based on the finite creation that we experience with our senses, is unable to describe an infinite God because we can't experience Him with our senses. So you can see where the problem would lie. Our language, therefore, can't be used of God univocally in this sense. So this doesn't answer the problem of religious language, the problem of our God talk. Well, my response to this would be just to attack premise 1. I would just say not all of our knowledge comes from our sense experiences. I would say there is some knowledge that God has hardwired into us, so to speak. A priori type knowledge, intuitive knowledge that doesn't come from our sense experiences. I would be very comfortable with that, if for no other reason than Romans 2, talking about the God writing His law, moral law on our hearts. So I think we do have knowledge from other things beyond just our senses, sense experience. The second position is that our God talk, our religious language, our words about God are equivocal. Now this position agrees that our language can't describe God at all, but it doesn't mean that our God talk is meaningless nonsense. Okay? So that sounds a little bit contradictory. Let me say that again. This position agrees that our language can't describe God exactly, but that doesn't mean our God talk is meaningless nonsense. So this position would say, look, yeah, God is infinite, and so He's always going to transcend our ability to understand and describe Him. And I think that seems reasonable to admit that, hey, God is infinite, we're finite, we're never going to fully understand Him, therefore we're never going to be able to fully explain Him or communicate accurately about Him. So this position would say, when we talk about Bob being good and God being good, there's really no connection between good in that first context with Bob and good as we used it to talk about God. There can't be, because Bob is just this finite creature and God is an infinite being. And so we mean completely different things when we use the term God to describe, use the term good to describe Bob and to describe God. One of the ways that I remember this position is I use the Q in equivocal to help me remember that this position holds that words we use in different contexts mean quite different things. That might be a stretch for you, but for somebody like me who has a really bad memory, I have to use little games and tricks like that to remember to use the right term for the right definition or the right idea. I understand the ideas fairly well, I think. I just always get them mixed up as to which term goes with which idea. So equivocal. When words are used to describe humans and God, they mean quite different things. They have no similarity at all. Now there's different equivocal language positions, okay? So in all of these positions, there's different nuances and different smaller camps within each big camp, of course. So some in this camp would say that our language can only describe what God does, not what God is really like, okay? In other words, our religious talk, our God talk, can describe the things that God does, but they can't describe who He really is in Himself, or what He is really like. And this was a pretty common position in the medieval era, where people thought this about our religious language, our God talk. Some in this camp would say that our finite language can only describe what God is not like. Our language can't describe what God is really like. It can only describe what He's not like. Our language can't describe, our language can only describe what He's not like. This goes by the term via negativa, I think I'm pronouncing that right, the way of negation. So this is very, very common in the medieval era. A lot of medieval theologians believe this. We can only describe what God is not like. Very common in the ancient and medieval world. Some in this camp, like the neo-Orthodox theologians in the 1900s, said that our God talk doesn't describe God, it can only describe our subjective experiences of God. That's what our God talk is. We're not actually describing God. That's impossible to do. So all of these positions would say it's impossible to describe what God is really like, but that doesn't mean our religious language is meaningless. We can describe either what God does, what God is not like, or we can describe our experiences of God, according to neo-Orthodox theologians in the 1900s. Well, let's talk about some of the problems with this equivocal position. Some critics would say, look, this position leaves us in agnosticism. It puts us in a position where we have to admit we really don't know what God is like at all. We don't know what God is really like. It leaves us in complete skepticism as to who or what God is really like. Critics of this position would say, look, if our God talk was equivocal, then we could say anything about God. We could even say things like God is a liar or God is evil, which we know is incorrect. So this position results in absurdities. If there's no relation at all to when we talk about Bob is good or Bob is a liar, when we say God is good or God is a liar, if there's no connection at all between the two uses of those words, then we could really say anything we wanted to about God. But that doesn't make any sense. Critics of this position would also point out that the Bible doesn't use the way of negation. The Bible doesn't merely say what God is not like. The Bible seems to describe what God is like. So if the Bible is using, finite human language, if you will, to describe God, it seems like it's appropriate to do so. So, in other words, or in another way you can think about it, when we say what God is not like, there is a sense in which we are saying what He is like. Right? So even the way of negation doesn't really accomplish what it's trying to accomplish. It's still describing God. So when you say of a being that He's not like this, you're saying that He is like the opposite. So in other words, if somebody's using the way of negation and they said, well, we can't really say what God is like, all we can say is what He's not like. We can say that God is not a liar. Well, what you're saying by that is that God tells the truth then. So you are saying something positive about God. You're saying that He is truthful. So even the way of negation can't really get around, claiming to say certain things about God. Every negation implies the opposite. And then lastly, some people would criticize this position and say, we're made in God's image, so there has to be some similarity between us and God. So if He made us in His image, it seems like there should be ways in which we could use our language, or that there's some attributes at least that we share, humans share with God if we're made in His image. So it makes sense that we should be able to understand God and even describe what He's like to some degree, because we were made in His image. And so we should be able to understand Him, if for no other reason that we understand ourselves a bit. And if we're made in His image, we should then therefore be able to understand Him. So they would see this position as quite extreme, that we can't know anything about what God is really like, or communicate anything about God, what God is really like. Well, the last position, this might be a mediating position between those two extremes, is that our God talk is analogous. It's not exactly the same. So when we use a term to describe Bob, a finite human being, and we use the same term to describe God, we don't mean exactly the same thing. So Bob is good, God is good. We don't mean exactly the same thing, so it's not univocal, but there is a connection between the goodness of Bob and the goodness of God. There's some sort of analogous connection. It's not the exact same, not univocal, but it's not equivocal. It's not completely different. There's some connection. So the two extremes, the two terms God don't mean, the two terms, or the two uses of the term good mean exactly the same thing, or they don't mean the same thing at all. The analogous position says, no, they are connected, they are related. There is some connection, some similarity between, but how much? That becomes the question. How much of a connection is there between the goodness of Bob and the goodness of God? So this position would make use of the idea that we're made in God's image, so there should be some sort of connection there, some sort of analogy, if you will, between us and God, since we're made in His image. We're similar to Him, so we can reject the equivocal position, but we also know we're not exactly like Him, so we can reject the univocal position. As you can imagine, there's critics of this position as well, right? So problems that critics point out with the analogous position. It's a middle ground position, so people on both ends are going to find problems with it, right? The univocalists and the equivocalists are going to find problems with this middle ground position, so they get attacked from both sides. The equivocal position just says that what they're really doing is they're sneaking in the idea of univocal language. So they're kind of, through the back door, they're sneaking in univocal language. That words used to describe finite humans mean the same thing when used to describe God. So the equivocal position says, well, this analogous position, what it really is, once you really get to understand it, is that it's just univocal. It's just the univocal position fancied up a little bit. The univocal folks, though, the univocal position says that this position still leads to skepticism and agnosticism about what God is really like. Because they'll point out things like, well, again, the continuum. If we're saying that Bob is good and God is good, and those two uses of the term good are analogous, how analogous are they? You're just kind of kicking the can down the street. You're not really solving the problem. We're not saying they're exactly the same, so how different are they? And it's a continuum being, well, not very similar to, yeah, very similar on this end. And if we don't know where they fall in the continuum, then it might as well be equivocalism. It might as well be we're back to agnosticism and skepticism. We don't really know what God is really like. We just have analogies of God. So the univocal position would criticize this position in that way. In other words, these terms analogous, these terms similar are too ambiguous. They're not really helpful. They're not clear enough. Two things could be very similar, very analogous, or barely similar, barely analogous at all. And there's such a large range, is this even helpful? So that's how the univocal position would criticize the analogous position. So the last position I want to talk to you about is, as I said before, this fourth position is kind of a hybrid position. And this is a position that I gleaned from Norman Geisler. So Norman Geisler was a well-known Christian apologist and theologian. And this was his position on the issue. He said the words themselves are univocally defined, but applied analogously when it comes to finite human beings and an infinite God. So the example that we're using for this conversation is when we say that Bob is a good person, Bob's a good guy, and we say that God is good, we're using the exact same definition of good in both of those scenarios. But we're applying the term analogously. We're applying the term, even though we mean the same thing when we use the term good, talking about Bob and talking about God, we're applying it differently. We're applying it analogously to Bob and to God, recognizing that Bob and God are quite different beings. So univocal at the level of word definitions, but analogous in terms of applying those word definitions to these quite different beings. Obviously, God is good in a much greater, in fact, an infinitely greater way. God is good more than Bob is good. But it's the same definition of good, it's just applied to God infinitely, because he's an infinite being, where it's applied only to God finitely. And there's a sense in which this makes sense, especially to me, because God is infinitely and perfectly good, whereas Bob's goodness is merely a reflection of God's goodness. So especially in my understanding of morality, that somebody is morally good if and when they image God's goodness. So again, going back to the fact that we were made in God's image and that we are morally good when we reflect God's goodness, and that's in the sense in which our understanding of God can come from our understanding of finite goodness. And this happens, as children learn what goodness is, moral goodness, by their interactions with their parents and their siblings and their friends, and they grow up and they learn about goodness. And then maybe later in life they come to find out that about God. And goodness, he's the source of goodness because he's the standard of goodness. And he just is good, right? But their learning of goodness came from their experiences as a young human being growing up. And so there is a sense in which we can learn about God from the creation as we learn about God, and then we learn about things, morality in this sense, and then come to realize that God is the source and the ultimate standard of goodness. And these things that we learned about morality and goodness are just mere reflections of God, who is goodness itself. So that, being made in His image does play a big, important role here. So I have a lot of sympathy for Norman Geisler's position, that just in the terms of morality, our goodness is a finite reflection of God's goodness. So it's the same term. When we use good, we're meaning the same thing, but clearly there's a difference when we use goodness of a finite being like Bob than when we use it of God. Overall, I think this type of study is really good and helpful because it warns us to be careful with our language. We don't want to be throwing out terms haphazardly when we try to describe God, but we should be very careful about it. And I think this sort of a study is a good way to consider who God is and what God is like. But ultimately, what we're trying to do in this class with this particular topic is to respond to people who bring it to us as a problem for theism. So remember, we started this topic by saying this is often a problem, the problem of religious language, that's used to argue against the existence of God, or even trying to talk about an infinite being. And we would just say, using at least these last two positions, maybe some of the other ones too, depending on your theological position, responding to it by saying, no, our God talk's not meaningless. It's not incoherent to try to talk and describe and understand an infinite being for these various reasons. We were made in His image. He gave us ideas about Himself in our minds, built into us. We have ideas about His attributes built into us. So there's reasonable explanations we can give as to why our God talk isn't incoherent, meaningless. Okay, well, let's look at the class schedule. This is the very last night of lecturing for the class. It's May 6th, and we did 2 lectures tonight. We did the problem of human freedom and divine determinism, and now we just covered the problem of religious language. There was one chapter you had to read for tonight. That was Frank Turek's book, chapter 15. So that reading summary is due by midnight tonight. Also due tonight by midnight is your research paper. So that's due tonight, May 6th. I emailed out to the class your final exam today. So you should have gotten that via email, and you have 1 week to complete that. So just like before, it's an essay exam. I would recommend you do, work on 1 per day, so you're not overwhelmed trying to do it all the last day before it's due. And then you have to email it back to me by midnight on May 13th, the final. And that'll be the last thing due in this class, and it'll be all over with. Unfortunately, I do have a little bit of reading for you this week as you're working on your exam. Appendix 2 in Frank Turek's book, and then in the book Thinking About God, chapters 20, 24, 25, 26, and 27. But they're all very short. Shouldn't take you much time at all. But those reading summaries will be due on May 13th, as well as your final exam, and then the class is all over. So I've really enjoyed teaching this class. I've taught it for several years now in different seminaries and contexts, and really enjoyed the material. Apologetics is my primary area of ministry, so I want to serve people and help people in this particular area. So even if after the class is over with, if there are things that come up in your own life and ministry, or people that you're trying to help with these answers, and you need a refresher, or you have something that we haven't talked about in the class, let me know how I can help, and I'll try to be a resource for you. Thanks so much for taking the class.